So Sandy is coming up to do the early in Jesus' ministry reading that is paralleled again right after his resurrection. So Sandy is reading for you sort of the start of his ministry and the start of Jesus' interaction with the fishing people who became his disciples. And then he reenacts it after his resurrection. So there's something about Jesus that he uses the life experiences of those he is teaching to bring his point home. And he begins by teaching his disciples, those who are going to leave their boats behind temporarily and follow him. He teaches them about the abundance of how they will be provided for, the abundance of life that they are choosing to engage with as they become followers of Jesus. And he continues it. Jesus uses metaphors. Most of the parables, scholars think, they're not sitting in a synagogue and Jesus is sort of telling them stories. They're a peripatetic group. They're out there walking around. And when Jesus starts to teach, he's pulling metaphors. He's pulling images from their surroundings. And now that comes up again in this week's text in John chapter 21. Aha. Thank you for giving the slides up. So let's move to the resurrection slide. This is my favorite image of the resurrection, the light coming out. And we talked so much about that last week, of the shining beings who radiated the light and mirrored the light of the resurrected Christ out into the world to those who were dumbfounded by it, to those who were terrified by it, and to those who were deeply, deeply comforted as Jesus walked around on that Easter Sunday. Slide 3. What we know from reading the Gospels and reading the resurrection accounts, that Jesus' circle of friends was big. Bigger than anybody knew. Because we tend to think in our Western art world that there were just 12 guys who followed Jesus around. Much bigger circle than that. There were the women who followed Jesus, and then there was this much larger group of people. We know that because they appear even in the resurrection, his resurrection experiences. The people who were involved in that weekend, there were a lot of women, and as we said last week, like there are a lot of Sandys in our church, there are a lot of women in the story. And if you sort of call the name Sandy in our church, somebody will likely show up and do something useful. The same thing happened with these Marys. All of these Marys were likely to stand up and do something useful. We have Mary Magdalene, someone called the other Mary. We have Mary, the mother of James. We have Joanna, Salome, someone called group called the other women. And we have potentially Cleopas' wife, the two disciples that are walking on the road to Emmaus. There's a very good chance that it was a couple, and it was Cleopas and his wife. And just because everybody else's name is Mary, I think go ahead and think about Cleopas' wife as Mary. So we've got Cleopas and another Mary walking on the road to Emmaus and meeting with Jesus. There are a lot of men besides the 12. There's Cleopas, their companions. That is a very broad word of people who show up in the resurrection accounts. And we have Joseph of Arimathea, the secret follower of Jesus who offers his burial place. We have Nicodemus, we know, that came to Jesus and became a follower of his. Jesus had a huge circle of friends besides just the 12. We also see as we look at the Easter account that Jesus chose remarkably quiet interactions on Easter. He saw only close friends. He did some gardening. He went for a long walk. He had simple meals with good people. He did not go for public glory, self-defense, or revenge. He did not have the angels take over the choir loft in the temple, even though they were in town. It was a very quiet day in Jerusalem. And remarkably, it remained quiet in Jerusalem. There never was a demonstration, an appearance at the palace, an appearance at the temple at the very least. Two of the gospel writers tell us that actually Jesus left Jerusalem altogether shortly after his resurrection. Matthew tells us that Jesus went to Galilee straight from the tomb. John says that Jesus hangs out in Jerusalem for another week, apparently, in John, to see Thomas, who missed dinner the week before. I love that about Jesus, that we get this story that he hangs around because Thomas did not get to see him, and Thomas matters. We call him Doubting Thomas. I think we should call him Treasured Thomas. Jesus hung around so that Thomas could see him too. And then, in John, Jesus heads to Galilee. And once he comes to Galilee, Jesus keeps a low profile there too. There are no public appearances, as far as we know. There are no family reunions, as far as we know. There are no parties with great wine, like the one he was at the very start of his ministry. He doesn't teach in the synagogue or heal in the neighborhood. What we know is that Jesus just shows up for breakfast on the beach with 7 disciples who have gone fishing. They have gone back to their boats. They've gone back to their hometown. They have heard that Jesus is going to join them there. Mary has given that message for them. So who knows what they are thinking, what they are looking for. But that's where Jesus meets them. This is the map from Google Maps that shows you really how far the walk is from Jerusalem to Capernaum, right? It says it's 164 kilometers, which would take you 34 hours to walk. So even if Jesus got to Galilee before the disciples did, it would take them at least a day and a half, probably 3 or 4 days, to make that journey from Jerusalem back to Capernaum. So you have to factor that distance in to your thinking about the days following the resurrection. So we come to John 21. It's a classic text. It gets preached on almost every Easter season. Here's what it says. After these days, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. Tiberias is a city on the Sea of Galilee. He shows himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee. And remember, his first miracle happened in Cana of Galilee. This is like a bridge between those two things. Nathanael's there. That's how he met Jesus. And the sons of Zebedee, and we know them as James and John, and just 2 others of his disciples. Were they part of the 12? Or were they part of this great crowd, this big circle of friends that Jesus had following him around? So Peter stands up. He's kind of the leader of the crowd in many ways. Peter stands up and says, I'm going fishing. Like, Jesus hasn't shown up here at the house. I'm just going to go fishing. And so they said, well, we'll go with you. And they went out and got into the boat, but that night, caught nothing. We're mirroring the Luke 5 passage where they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, when they would be coming back in, Jesus stood on the beach. The disciples didn't know it was Jesus. Here's this guy off in the distance, standing on the beach, hollering at them, waving, get their attention. And he hollers, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Well, cast the net to the right side of the boat and you'll find some." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. The parallels. So the disciple that Jesus loved said to Peter, and remember, we said this last week, traditionally it's believed that John is the disciple that calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. But we also know that every disciple, every follower of Jesus knew that they were loved by Jesus. So that disciple, a disciple whom Jesus loved, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked. So there's something respectful about that. Oftentimes Peter gets made fun of for, putting on clothes and then jumping in the water. But there's something respectful about putting your clothes back on before you go to meet the resurrected Jesus. So Peter's Peter. The other disciples came in with the boat because they're not going to leave all those fish. They are happy to see Jesus, but they're going to bring that catch in. And they dragged the net full of fish. They were only about 100 yards off from land. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with some fish on it and bread. And Jesus said, well, bring some of the fish that you have just caught. So Jesus has been there early, and he's caught like the first course of fish and is cooking them. But he says, well, bring some of the fish you've caught. So Simon Peter goes out, went aboard, hauled the net ashore, which he had help with that. And the weirdest thing about this text is that it says there were 153 of them, 153 fish. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast." None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" Because now they knew it. It was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. And this was the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So if we put all the stories together, we have Jesus appearing to the disciples, the gathered as a group on Easter night, the group on the next Sabbath night when Thomas shows up, and now here, this to the larger group of them. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus says to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." And those of you who know this story know that it's a three-part back and forth. Jesus keeps saying, "Do you love me?" And Peter keeps saying, "You know I love you." And Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." So, things to wonder about in this story. I am so curious about what's with the lamb metaphor that Jesus pulls in. They're on a fishing trip, right? Shouldn't he have used a fishing metaphor with Peter? But again, it's more evidence that Jesus grabbed props from his environment for his stories. He didn't carefully craft a narrative here that had no mixed metaphors in it. Jesus is happy to grab metaphors from various places and use them, because metaphors that would be familiar to his followers, to use them to make a point. A more important thing to worry about. What's with all these unidentified disciples in the resurrection stories? We have 5 names that we know of, that we know they're part of the 11. We have 2 who are just others of disciples. Collectively, Jesus calls them children. So he sees them as a group. We wonder who the 2 might have been. We wonder if the Marys also got out of town. Were the Marys part of this group that followed Jesus? These women followed him up and down that 34-hour walk corridor several times during his ministry, back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem. In my imagination, they have followed him to Galilee. You know, we have Mary the Tower and all of the other Marys. The Sandys would have all gone together, right? We would have, I don't know, we probably would have gotten bikes and ridden the distance, but you know, the Marys, I think they went too. And there are others known to us, but they are friends, others unknown to us, but they are friends of Jesus. And all of these unnamed, unknown, unidentified people in the resurrection appearances have to fuel our imaginations and enlarge our vision of the church. Another question worth asking of this story, things to ponder, things worth asking. Who counted the fish? Right? Who counted the fish? It is such an unusual thing in the Bible for there to be a number that is this specific. And somehow it was such a specific number that they remembered it, and it got attached to the story that got told to the early church and handed down, and ultimately it got written down in the gospel reading, in the Gospel of John. And 153, is that, how does that compare to other days on the water? Was this an enormous catch? Was it a normal catch? We don't know that. Were they little fish? Were they huge fish? But it balances out to 21.85 fish per person that we're told were on the boat. And I think that would have been enough to feed their people, each person, whoever they were, their family, their friends, for about a week. But this abundant catch is not a golden parachute. Like, Jesus does not provide for all of them enough fish that they can now retire and, I don't know, just have a rod instead of nets when they go fishing. And my takeaway from these fish, and especially whoever they were, did they count it twice? Did 2 different people count so they got that number exactly right? Was it James and John? Was it Peter and Nathaniel? Who's counting? But the fact that they're counting and the fact that they're out there fishing reminds all of us and comforts us that even on this side of the resurrection, work is still daily and difficult and sometimes disappointing. We have not failed if our lives are difficult and disappointing. And what we know is that even in those moments, God is still God and meets us in the dailiness of life. I talked about this one last year, and because it's probably my favorite question to ask of this text. You know, we've got the mixed metaphors, we have the fish. Why does this text specify that it was a charcoal fire and not a driftwood fire? Or, why a charcoal fire? And I posit that it's because it's a second charcoal fire that they have warmed themselves around in the context of Jesus' death and his resurrection. We're told that Peter, especially, was warming by a charcoal fire in the courtyard when he has the conversation where he denies that he knows Jesus. He is really caught off guard, can't pull it together fast enough, and says, no, not me. And that happens in John 18. The slaves and the police made a charcoal fire because it was cold. They were warming themselves. Peter was standing with them. They say, "You're not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denies it and he says, "I'm not." In John chapter 21, Jesus reprises that experience. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there and went to warm themselves. They were all wet, right? And Peter's especially wet. His clothes are wet. What Jesus does for these disciples in that resurrection appearance is what he does for us in many ways in our lives. Jesus uses the things that surround us. Here, he uses the smell of the fire. He uses the sound of the fire, the sight of the fire, the sensation of warmth in this fire to remind Peter and the other disciples of that previous night and to bring them to a place where they are forgiven and restored around a similar fire. It's an offer of forgiveness. It is an assurance of forgiveness as they gather around yet again. Jesus uses all possible means to reach out to his whole circle of friends, right? He is not just Peter he reaches out to, although this story focuses on Peter. But Jesus uses all means, especially to reach out to Peter in this particular story. And the invitation of this text, all these things we wonder about in this text, the invitation to us is to realize that Jesus uses all possible means to reach out to us. And the invitation to us is to pay attention. So, Lord God, we ask that you would give us the gift of paying attention, that we would recognize your presence in the things that we see, the things that are part of nature, the things that are part of other people, the things that are part of just our circumstances, that we would recognize your hand in all of this. And because we know that you are the same yesterday, today, and forever, we know that you are the same as you were with the disciples on the beach eating fish sandwiches as you are with us today. And for that we give you thanks. And God's people said together, Amen. Amen.